Right, and now we're going to bring onto the show Mark Devlin. He's been on the programme before and he's back. He's a club and radio DJ by profession, and he's a music journalist. And also he's a researcher, author and broadcaster on basically the kind of same things I am. The esoteric and conspiratorial matters. He's written several books, and his work in the music business has actually inspired him and led him into his current ideas about the New World Order and the Illuminati, and about spiritual and paranormal matters. The new book is called Musical Truth. It's just come out. Mark was previously on the programme, in programme 50, and he's back for a second visit. So that's really, really good. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for Mark Devlin. Ladies and gentlemen, listeners to the HPANWO show on HPANWO Radio, we have a returning guest. He's been on once before. He was a long time ago, actually. He was on in June 2013, so obviously a lot's happened since then. But it was very interesting talking to him before, and he's back. It's Mark Devlin. Hey, Mark.
Ben, good to be back, man.
Oh, great. It's great to have you back on the show. It really is. And
I can't believe it's been 3 years.
I know.
Time flies.
I didn't realise I've been doing HPANWO Radio that long, but at the time of recording, I'm not far short of my 200th programme, so that's quite something. And I know you've got a podcast too, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But you've now, what's interesting, we actually met up because you're a member of the Berkshire and Oxfordshire Seeking Solutions group, and we met a few weeks ago in Didcot. That's our meet-up. And we
brought the old man along.
Yeah, that's good. It's good you've got your family on your side, mate. My dad thinks I'm crazy. So does my daughter. So does my brother. So I'm getting it from all generations.
Well, other family members think I'm crazy. It's only my dad that doesn't.
Well, that's good. That's one. That's one more than me. But you would mention that you've been writing a book, and the book is now available. And it's called Musical Truth, which is an intriguing name. Yeah. And it's quite packed. It's over 500 pages. It's got covers some intriguing subjects. So let's talk about that. So, look, firstly, your background. I mean, you're in the music business yourself, aren't you?
Well, yeah, I've been a DJ for the last 26 years, radio and club DJ. So I've done various radio shows on different stations. I've done gigs all over the place. I've been fortunate enough to travel to lots of different countries. So if it all ended tomorrow, and it's kind of semi-ended, but it doesn't really matter because I've been there, done that, and bought the T-shirt several times over. I've had a good innings, can't complain about where my work has taken me in all that time. And it's really interesting for me now, just reflecting on everything that I've done as a DJ, because I'm finding myself coming up in the truth/conspiracy game now in very similar ways to how I came up in the DJ game all those years ago. And I'm drawing lots of analogies. So whereas I used to be chasing gigs and I would speak to club promoters and I would try and get myself on the bill of weekend event, weekenders and big club parties and stuff like that. What I'm doing now is speaking to conference organisers and meetup group organisers and trying to get myself on the bill as a speaker at these events to get this information out. And whereas I used to revere other DJs and I'd look up to guys like, Pete Tong and Tim Westwood and people like that, I've now got a different set of heroes. So I've traded all those DJs in for, researchers and speakers on the truth scene. So now, Ken O'Keefe and Max Egan and David Icke and Mark Passio and guys like that are my new heroes. And they're the ones I get excited about meeting. So it's really interesting the way my life has gone and the path that I've taken over the last few years, because I never imagined it was pan out this way. And if you told me a few years ago that I'd be doing this, I would never have believed you. But I've kind of gone with the flow and I've allowed synchronicity to sweep me along. And I've gone with where the universe is taking me. And I find that when you do that and you just let go and, allow yourself to be guided in that way, incredible things occur to you in your life. And you meet the very people that you're supposed to meet, and you find yourself in the very places that you're supposed to be in. And you're pretty much fulfilling what you came here to do, I feel, when you can just surrender to the forces of the universe, and allow that to happen. So very interesting process over the last few years.
It is, and I mean, my life is similar in that sense because, well, firstly, it's because you've got you've got some kind of parallels between your previous life and the life you have now, and it maybe will help you in that respect. It's interesting how things do resemble each other like that, situations resemble each other, even if they're very different in content. But I mean, life is. I mean, I've stopped really making long-term plans in my life because I found that it's so unexpected. Everything's so unexpected. I think back to myself as a kid and I used to imagine what I'd be when I was an adult, and the person that I am is totally different what I'm doing now. I mean, like I say, I have similar interests in you. I mean, the people you mentioned, Max Egan, David Icke, Ken O'Keefe, Mark Passio, I'm familiar with all those guys, and I'm also very, very fond of them, and I admire them a lot. So in a sense, we've both come from we've both come from the same spot from a different direction. I was in the National Health Service, hospital portering. Again, I feel like you. When I lost my job, I felt, well, I've got so much water under the bridge that I can just say, well, why not? You know, I've got no regrets there. But now I've got other jobs, like I'm a gardener and things like that. But basically, I'm like you. I'm going around. I do radio interviews as well as my own show. I speak at conferences and things like that. So, and I'm writing a book. It's like you. Well, it's nearly finished actually.
A lot of parallels.
I mean, your book. You're slightly ahead of me because your book is out and it's a bit longer than mine. I think it's going to be longer than mine. But so is this an autobiography? Would you say?
Not really. I did put a book out 9 years ago called Tales from the Flip Side, and I was in a very different place then. It's not at all what you'd consider a conscious read, because I was not a consciously awakened individual going back to 2007 when it was published. If anything, I was a member of the Walking Dead. You know, I was walking around in an induced trance state due to a lifetime of programming and conditioning, and I knew no better. You know, I believed what the mainstream media told me. I thought governments ran the world. I thought the music business was all about entertainment and having fun. And I never imagined that there were these deeper layers to everything, and that there was, you know, truth in the world waiting to be uncovered once you pull that veil back. So Tales from the Flip Side was just a collection of anecdotes, me recounting a bunch of stories from the sharp end of the DJ game. Funny things that had happened to me. So I'm kind of still proud of it, because that's the place that I was in back then. Is that music your end or mine?
No, I think it's I don't know where it's coming from. Is it the NSA or GCHQ? I don't know.
Is it my end?
It's not. I don't think it's mine. Yeah, it's strange. I don't think it's me. No, not at all. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen.
It is mine.
You can't get away from music, Mark. You can't get away from it.
It's GCHQ, mate. Messing with our minds.
Get a proper job, guys. Come on. I know they're listening.
Put the donuts down and do some proper work.
Yeah.
Anyway, where was I? Yeah, Tales from the Flip Side.
Because your book. I mean, I think I read that book actually. We talked about it on the previous show. I think we mentioned it.
I think we did. Yeah, I think we mentioned it back then.
Although it's so long ago, though, I can't remember.
Yeah. I'm kind of proud of it because it's where I was at the time. But if people pick up Musical Truth and they think, oh, we'll check out Devlin's previous book for more of the same, you'll be disappointed, because it's not more of the same. Musical Truth is a very different book, and it brings together everything I've come to understand over the course of the past 5 years about the true nature of reality, and what's going on in this world, who's running things, and specifically what the corporate mainstream music game is being used for in terms of mass mind control agendas and shaping social perceptions and people's perceptions of self and how they fit into the world. So everything that I know so far is between the covers of that book. Right. That's why it's so damn big, because it's 5 years worth of delving into this whole world of research since I first became aware in 2010 that this world is nothing like we thought it was. So I've kind of poured my heart into the book in many ways, because there's lots of me expressing my thoughts and my feelings and my sentiments about things, as well as imparting information. And the last couple of chapters of the book are me offering what I see as the solutions in terms of how we get ourselves out of all these problems that humanity is facing. And, I go into some quite deep areas there once we've got all the nuts and bolts business of what's being done through the music business with all the various tactics and methods out of the way. Then we, go deep as we finish the book.
Yeah, that's really good. And seeing it from the seeing it from the musical angle is important. And we talked in the previous program, I believe. I know I've spoken about this many times with many people, that the idea that music can be, the music industry, music itself can be used as a tool of control is not new. You've got a chapter called Nothing New Under the Sun, and I know this goes back to people like Theodor Adorno, who was a cultural Marxist think tank, member of the Frankfurt School, and he said,
that's right.
He actually said he did experiments like on putting music on car radios, slowed down the traffic and things like that. And
that's right.
So it's the idea that governments can use music as a tool of control is not a new one, and no doubt they've been, even if they're not doing it openly now, I'm sure they're doing it covertly in the covert psychological think tanks and psychological warfare institutions. So you've come across this. Your experience as a DJ has actually helped you come across these things, these ideas. You've actually seen it from the inside, in a sense.
Well, it really has, and I can look back on those 20 years that I spent as a DJ, and I talk about being in a sort of induced trance state, but I can see that it was meant to happen that way because it provided my grounding for being able to talk now about what I've discovered and what I was a part of. And I think through having been a DJ and through having been reasonably well known in my genre, I can be taken as speaking with some authority on the subject. Whereas if I was just some random dude making YouTube videos or doing a blog site or whatever, I don't think people would be paying the attention that they do to me, having been somebody that's worked, within these industries. And it's incredible to me because I can look back at those 20 years and it's so clear to me now the way that the music scene is used and the way that it's utterly controlled and the way all the artists are manipulated and the way that there's all sorts of unseen stuff going on beneath the surface when it comes to the nature of music recordings. When you get into the sound vibrations and the energy of a track, it can have all kinds of effects on human brain waves and emotions and mind states. And I understand all that now, and yet I didn't back then. And it just makes me wonder how I missed it. And I can look at something like how the hip-hop genre has been absolutely directed and controlled and steered in a particular direction over the course of the past 25 years. And I'm thinking about, the genre known as gangster rap, where all the lyrics that were going into hip-hop music were changed quite a long time ago, really. We're talking 25 years ago, when all the gun talk started to come in and all the misogyny and all these references to petty crime. And back then, you would have found me defending all this. I was a hip-hop DJ. I was playing this kind of music. And if you'd said to me, this music is affecting young people that are listening to it, and it's cultivating certain behaviors in them, and it's bringing about certain mind states and certain perceptions, I would have told you to get out of here. You're talking crap. You don't know what you're talking about, because I just was having none of it. And yet now, with the benefit of hindsight and the ability to have done the research and also maturity, as you get into middle age, you kind of mature, or at least you should, and you start to see some of the errors of your ways from your younger years, the sins of your youth. And that's a process that I've been through. And so I can understand how everything has been manipulated.
Yeah, I can. And as far as hip hop goes, I'm sure I remember we discussed this on the previous program. I play hip hop songs on this show, but they always seem to be ones more than 20 years old. And I bring this up with the listeners. I said that there's some excellent ones in the genre but they all seem to be in the past. And I play and I play bands like Soul to Soul and things like that. And I say, but you look at it now. You look at what you have done. We talked about this before. About you get these really horrible individuals who just lay out a stream of N-words and MF words and wave guns around and say horrible things about women. I'm no feminist, but I don't call women hoes, which I didn't even know. That's a gardening tool, isn't it? And I had to look it up. I had to actually look it up and things like that. And I think some of the young people in society, people like teenagers are listening to this. And as you say, there's a lot of money goes into this. We're going to talk about this, I'm sure, but the billions that are spent in promoting these bands and the amount they earn, and they live in mansions. These guys, they drive Rolls Royces and for spouting this vulgar drivel.
The ones that live in mansions and have yachts and drive Bentleys are the ones that have allowed themselves to be absolutely controlled and used as stooges and foot soldiers for the industry corporations that control them. So we're talking the likes of Jay-Z, obviously, and Kanye West, and guys like that, Dr. Dre, Puff Daddy. These are the ones that have literally sold their soul for fame and fortune. And people hear that phrase and they think it's a metaphor or it's just something to make the point. But my research has shown that there is a very real sense in which artists do sell their soul in exchange for all this stuff. If they are that hungry for success that they're prepared to degrade their morals and their humanity to such a degree that they allow themselves to be absolutely under the control of the industry overlords that preside over these things, then they can be said to have lost their soul. Yeah. And I think that is what happens. And in the book, I detail a few insiders that have spoken about the nature of the initiation rituals and parties and orgies that these individuals are required to go through before they get elevated up to the top levels of the industry. So it's stories to make your hair curl. It really is. If you think of Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut and the scenes from that party in the mansion there, I mean, if anything, that is mild. That makes it like a Girl Guides picnic in terms of what insiders have said about what really goes on at these parties and the sort of stuff that they're required to go through. And they do this to completely degrade them and to completely put them in the hands of their controllers. And you can be sure that all this stuff that they get up to is videotaped, and those tapes are archived and kept safely somewhere should they be needed. And should these artists or these producers step out of line or go off script or start talking about things that the industry doesn't want them talking about, then out comes the recording, and who knows where it will end up. You hear about this in the world of politics. Politicians are corrupted and compromised in this way. They go to these wild parties and get up to who knows what, who wants to know. And you best believe that these people are blackmailed as well into conformity. So that's what goes on.
Yeah, and I mean, it's absolutely right. And of course, politics and music, of course, in this case, do the same thing. You've got a chapter on the BBC as well, and of course, that it can be found in the TV world of TV. And what's been exposed about the TV world, I'm sure it's just it's a tiny tip of an enormous iceberg about the vice and depravity of the BBC and beyond, which it's in chapter 3 of your book, Secrets and Lies. Yep. And I can well believe it. It's in a sense this is these people not only are experts in psychology, but I mean I do believe. I mean I've listened to Mark Passio like you have, and I do think it is black magic. It is literally the deviant creation that they are conjuring up in people's on a spiritual level, and these rituals are designed to do that, I believe.
Yeah, well it is. And anyone that looks at what goes on in the music business and chalks it all up as, it's just greedy corporations wanting to make money. And you get things like, the demise of Prince recently, the demise of David Bowie, and then going back, the likes of Michael Jackson and John Lennon and Bob Marley. And a lot of people accept that these artists were taken out, that the industry occasionally gets rid of one of its key players. And skeptics who reject any kind of religious, esoteric, supernatural, otherworldly elements to it will say, they do it just to make loads of money off the artist, because it's the old adage that a dead artist is worth more than a live one. That is certainly an aspect to what goes on. And when an artist of the stature of Prince or David Bowie passes away, certainly the corporations make shitloads of money off them. Yeah, it's evident that is the case. But if you think that's as far as it goes, then you really are missing the point, because we're talking about a spiritual war that's going on here. And the individuals that run these institutions in the entertainment industry and every other facet of daily human life. So it's no different in politics. It's no different in big business, the big corporations. It's no different in the military. It's no different in the world of science. It's no different in the mainstream media or the news corporations and all of that. At the very top of all these institutions, you have a dark, occult, ritualistic priest class that are practicing a religion that goes way back to the ancient world. And it appears to be very much steeped in a reverence and a veneration for the dark influence of the planet Saturn, Saturn is very key to it. And many commentators have said that it's a Saturn death cult that we're dealing with here. So we have basically dark magicians performing ceremonial magic rituals. People may choose to reject that if they're hearing it for the first time. They may choose to scoff at it. If they do, they quite clearly have not done the research, and they've quite clearly not allowed the truth to take them wherever it needs to go, because there is ample evidence to demonstrate that this is the case. There have been many insiders and whistleblowers that have worked in these industries that have come forward and confirmed that these type of practices go on. And this is the reason why they have such a hold over people's minds, why the mind control runs so very deep, why I was taken in for 20 years and had no idea that I was being mind controlled and socially engineered and having my thoughts and perceptions shaped for me by people I'd never met. The reason this is able to take place is because we're dealing with dark occult ritualistic practices. You know, it's magic with a K, which Aleister Crowley used to talk about, and it's going on all the time in the industry. And what I'm trying to do in the book is demonstrate some of the methods that are being used against us all the time, because there's got to be a reason why they invest so much time and energy and logistics into all this stuff that they do. I detail in the book all the symbols that go into music videos now, all the symbology and the imagery that goes into live stage shows at the likes of the Grammys and the US Super Bowl halftime show and the MTV Video Awards and all this. All these shows by the likes of Madonna and Katy Perry that are absolutely steeped in Kabbalistic imagery, Freemasonic imagery. You know, why would they be doing all that if it wasn't having some kind of magic effect on the subconscious minds of the general public?
Yeah, there's the pyramid over the Glastonbury Festival, you know, that big pyramid thing. Do you remember that?
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, is this all just coincidence? Is this all just trying to look cool? Is it all fashion? Because that's another thing people say. You point out all these signs and symbols, all these artists throwing up the devil horns and doing the triangle of manifestation and covering one eye and throwing up the 666s with their fingers. And people just say, oh, they're trying to look cool, or they're trying to be controversial. They're just trying to get talked about. And again, there might be an element of that. It does get the artist talked about, but there's got to be another reason and a better reason and a stronger reason why it's being done. And so those that just say it's all about money and it's all about trying to look cool really are missing the point.
Yeah. Now, in your book, I mean, you have the table of contents here, and it's very, very interesting because you cover so many things. Now, I want to talk to you certainly more about some of the modern, more recent artists who are, and some of the things they're up to. But this goes back a long way. I mean, and you tackle some of the household names, some of the great cultural icons we're talking about here. You have a chapter called, which says "Scratching the Surface of the Beatles," and now the Beatles, of course, is previous generations we're talking about here for most people alive today. But is there a dark story behind the Beatles?
Well, what I've managed to uncover about them pretty much goes back to the character you mentioned earlier, Theo Adorno. There is a strong theory that the Beatles were a product of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations in London, which is very much connected to the Frankfurt School. And it's a think tank all to do with social engineering and shaping public attitudes towards culture and basically hijacking culture, popular culture, and steering it in a certain direction. There was a guy called John Coleman who was a former British intelligence operative, and he came out as a kind of insider. Absolutely, yeah. He wrote the book The Committee of 300, really spilling the beans on the nature of the power structure that we have, which many would call the Illuminati, and talking about the fact that it all boils down to a very limited number of key players, really, when you look at it, that are controlling the rest of the world's population. And it's incredible the way in which they've been able to do it. But the key to it has been them understanding the nature of reality, the way the laws of the universe work, and the way the human psyche works, and the relationship between these. And if you're armed with that knowledge, and if you're a small group of people that are very dedicated and very committed towards bringing about certain goals, you can get that job done. You can achieve that. This is where the rest of us are at a significant disadvantage, because the vast majority of people don't understand the ways in which the universe works, in this context, and the way in which the human mind works, and is therefore malleable and programmable. And also, the rest of us do not seem to be able to get on the same page and unite towards common goals that we want to achieve. That is our weakness, and that's being exploited the whole time by those that seek to control us.
Yeah.
So going off at a tangent there, but yeah, Theo Adorno is a guy that has been connected with the Beatles in terms of what John Coleman and others have said about them. The Beatles also have a lot of connections going into the dark occult teachings and the mystery school religion of Aleister Crowley, that notorious British occultist.
Yeah.
And it seems you can't really have a conversation about the backstory of the music industry, either in the UK or the US, without Aleister Crowley's name popping up every bloody 5 minutes.
He even appears on the album cover, doesn't he? The Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club thing.
Absolutely. And, Crowley is like the original rock star in his own right. And the backstory of the industry just intertwines with Crowley's teachings and his Book of Magic at every turn. It's just incredible. So the Beatles are just one act that have been very closely associated with Aleister Crowley. And many people have speculated on where the very name of the Beatles came from. It's supposed to be wordplay, because it's like beat, as in they were a beat group. But the winged beetle, the scarab beetle, was a very important emblem in Egyptian mythology, going back to ancient Kemet. And this was a creature that was very much revered by that culture. And that ties into some of Crowley's teachings as well. So that raises the question of what the Beatles really meant. And Aleister Crowley published a book called The Winged Beetle, a book of poetry. So, there seem to be ties going into that. And then you get the suspicion that rather than the Beatles being these four lovable lads from Liverpool that got together and formed this band and played a few songs and jammed together and worked really hard and had a bit of good luck, and then they just happened to smash through into the mainstream, and they just happened to become this overnight success with girls going crazy and fainting and screaming and all the rest of it. You get the suspicion that actually none of that stuff happened by accident or by chance or naturally, because the forces that control the industry would not allow that to be the case.
Yeah, so
they
weren't just sort of like lucky lads who got lucky, who were very, very good. So yeah, so
well, that's what we're supposed to believe.
Yeah, that's what we're told.
Of all the groups coming out of Liverpool and other cities at that time, they just happened to be the ones that the public took to, and they worked really hard and had a stroke of good luck, But it becomes clear when you study the true nature of the industry and also how far back this story goes. It literally goes back to the very instigation of these industries, and it leads to the suspicion that these institutions were actually set up for the specific purpose of mind controlling large numbers of people through their key players, their chosen ones. So they've always had their favourites that they've elevated to the very top of the game, and they wouldn't allow something like the Beatles gaining that type of success to just go to chance. They would have to be in control of it. So the suspicion is that the Beatles were absolutely manipulated into place as the number one group of the 60s, and the success that they enjoyed was all part of a plan, because those that run these industries, they can pretty much make anything happen. If they want you to be the biggest group out there, if they want you to be a household name known both sides of the Atlantic, they absolutely have the logistics in place to enable that to happen. So that's what many people think was the case with the Beatles. You also get the suspicion that they may have been mind controlled. I mean, this happens with a lot of artists, a lot of the key players, when you get into the world of trauma-based mind control. It's very difficult to say with the Beatles. It's far easier to point to other artists as examples of trauma-based mind control victims, particularly with the current glut, the contemporary artists that we have.
Yeah.
It's far more difficult with the Beatles, but these are all things that have been suggested over the years.
It's possible,
and this is before we get into Paul is Dead, which is another show in itself.
Exactly. I'm going to do one of those with Nick Colostrum soon. But
great.
I've done a video about that. But the idea that they could be mind controlled is perfectly possible, because we know that projects like MK Ultra were active at the time when the Beatles were emerging.
Absolutely.
We also, I mean, the Aleister Crowley thing. The interesting thing about Aleister Crowley, he was a rock star in the sense that he certainly had a rock star lifestyle. He was very rich. He was obsessively promiscuous. He took lots of drugs.
Whole load of drugs, whole load of sex, whole load of rock and roll.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, like, we know several other artists like Jimmy Page who was openly into Crowley and lived in Crowley's old house and things like that. And I mean, the spiritual aspect of it is very interesting because, I mean, you look at these videos of the old concerts and the noise from the audience was so loud, the screaming of these young women, that Epstein was considering giving the guys earplugs to stop them going deaf. We're looking at these young women who, in any other circumstances, would be said to be in states of religious ecstasy. They are completely hysterical. I mean, they're not listening to the music. They're just screaming at the top of their voice. They must have terrible sore throats after the concert. Yeah. And they're not in a normal state of consciousness.
Yeah, it's almost as if they've been put in a trance state through music on an unseen level.
Yeah, I mean, these are images you might find in the old days in religious temples, where people would be put into an altered state of consciousness of, maybe even through the use of, like, the oracles in ancient Greece, where they used to take various drugs and things like that. It's almost like that. Not these girls were taking drugs, but they don't need any, do they? I mean, it's just whatever formula was coming out from this band, whether it was sexual or whether it was the music itself, probably a combination of both.
Yeah, there was a point which came up in a conversation that I had the other day regarding Prince and some of the more occult, esoteric aspects of Prince and some of the very strange circumstances surrounding his reported death.
Yeah, I'm glad we got to speak. Because remember, we were going to record this interview, ladies and gentlemen, before Prince died, but you weren't well. I mean, you were ill, so we had to put it off. And it's a good job we did, Mark.
Well, in many ways, yeah. This was around Easter, and I went down with bronchitis for a couple of weeks. I can't think what was that, Ben. I can't think what might be making people ill with respiratory diseases. Is there anything you can think of?
I'm looking up at the sky right now.
Yeah, I can't imagine what might have caused that. But yeah, I was quite ill over Easter, so we postponed the show. And maybe it was fortuitous because we can now talk about Prince. Actually, just as my book was due to go to Prince at the turn of the year, I got the news of David Bowie on the 11th of January. And I contacted my publisher and said, is it possible to get anything in there about Bowie? It was a very advanced stage in the typesetting. But my publisher, who was a fan of Bowie, said, absolutely, we should. We should get something in there to mark the occasion. So I was able to pull the book back and add 4 pages about some of the stranger stuff concerning Bowie. But there was no chance to do that regarding Prince. Prince does crop up a couple of times in the book in name checks. But I wasn't able to get the full story in there. But the other day I was recording a podcast and we were talking about the incredible, prodigious, genius talent that Prince was and how he was able to be a multi-instrumentalist. He wrote all his songs, he produced them, he arranged them. He also wrote songs for other artists. He cultivated the image of other artists. He was a great dancer. He was an actor. He was a film producer. There was like nothing he couldn't do.
Yeah.
And we were talking about the concept of great artists, these legendary, iconic artists, actually channeling this kind of creativity from other realms. And we were talking about the Muses, who were these figures, these goddess-type figures that were revered in ancient Greek culture and ancient Roman culture and various other cultures. And there were said to be these spiritual beings that inspired the poets and the philosophers and the writers and the artists throughout the ages. And they provided them with these gifts of incredible creative, expressive talent. And basically, these individuals were being used as vehicles or conduits to bring all this stuff through. That's actually where we get the word music from, the Muses, because the idea was that when musicians perform, they're pulling through all this stuff from spiritual realms. And that really does seem to be the case with so many of these prominent artists. And what you were saying there about the Beatles kind of putting audiences into a trance-like state or kind of like religious ecstasy, that seems to be very compatible with this idea that these artists are being used as channels for all this creative energy that's coming from elsewhere. And I think we've seen it with so many artists through the ages.
Well, I've had that in my life, Mark. I mean, sorry to interrupt, but I mean, this is something that I actually, when I'm writing, I think I channel a muse occasionally when I'm writing.
Yeah, I get the same thing.
Yeah, I mean,
I get the same thing when I'm doing these interviews. Sometimes, you know, an interviewer will ask me a question, and I'll chat for 5 minutes, and then I'll think back to what I've just said, and I'll think, where the hell did that just... You know, that was not on my mind, and yet I've just articulated it. I've brought it through from somewhere. So I think it does happen to a lot of us.
Yeah, exactly. You were talking about David Bowie. Sorry to interrupt.
Well, I was just making the point that Bowie is another artist similar to Prince that just seemed to be born to do it. You know, I can't imagine David Bowie having been a lorry driver.
No.
I can't imagine Prince ever flipping burgers in some diner, you know. The only thing these guys were ever going to do in their human lifetime was be a performer, be an artist. They were absolutely born to do it. They were vessels for putting this incredible creative work out into the world and inspiring the millions of people that they have around the world. And I really do believe that all of us come here for a reason. All of us have a purpose to our lives. I think I'm just starting to find mine. It took me long enough, but I think I need to be out there putting this information into the world. That is my contribution. That is how I'm participating in this realm of existence. You know, and other people have different contributions to make, and their lives will take a very different path. But it goes back to what I was saying at the start about following your true path and just allowing the universe to take you where you need to be. Certainly what these prominent artists were doing, even though there was corporate meddling, of course, in their affairs, you still had this amazing talent. Otherwise, the corporations would not have spent so much time trying to meddle in their affairs and trying to steer them in certain directions. You know, I think that the sheer talent of somebody like Bowie or Prince or any other artist you might care to mention does not go unnoticed. That's why they become the key players.
And their creativity, in a sense, harnessed to this dark agenda, do you think?
Yeah, I think their creativity is co-opted in many ways, and they are sent down certain paths. And I think some artists go down those paths more willingly than others. Some clearly rebel against it, and history has shown that when you rebel against the forces that control these corporations, unfortunately, there's usually a very heavy price to pay. Yeah. But then we get into the realms of mind-controlled artists, because there are some artists that are kind of plucked out of obscurity because there's some raw talent that's recognized there, and you get some kind of industry spotter that says this individual or this group can be put to use in our agenda. Let's get them signing on the dotted line and we'll, you know, steer them down the path we want for them. But then you get artists that come from a different kind of background, which is where we get into these generational bloodlines where mind control and satanic ritual abuse is present. And that's a very dark and murky world. Yeah. But unfortunately, it is a reality. And we have seen various artists through the decades that have shown signs of having come out of these kind of generational bloodlines where they're literally bred from childhood for a life in the public spotlight.
Yeah, that's a very dark. I mean, we know we could probably think of some examples we can go into. I mean, Jim Morrison, for example. I know he was the son of a famous head of intelligence. I think it's U.S. Naval Intelligence.
Yeah, that's right.
So they do come out of these families, and we've from these various families. But that's maybe something we can go into. I mean, the Paul is dead thing. I think we're going to have to skip simply because, as I said, we can do an entire show on it, and I plan to.
Well, I think we should. Yeah.
Yeah, but that is
your man for that.
Yeah, he's written a book on this, which is very interesting, and I hope to talk to him more in the future. But I mean, you've mentioned, you have a whole chapter talking about military intelligence connections to LSD. Now, LSD, this drug that had an incredible effect culturally, didn't it, on the young generation at that time? I mean, you only got to watch the film Yellow Submarine, which of course was made by the Beatles, and you can understand that film could not be made in the modern world. it could not be made because the LSD was then criminalised at a certain point. But for a while, it was freely available. But
yeah.
So, I mean, I know, for instance, who's it? Timothy O'Leary was kind of the guru of the LSD type culture.
Yeah, the acid guru.
Yeah.
I mean, there were so many social changes that took place in that second half of the 1960s. And what was being rolled out in the UK was echoed by what was happening in the US. And again, can this really be by chance? The fact that you had all the music changing and becoming psychedelic and very experimental. And you had groups that had been around for years, such as the Beatles, whose music suddenly started to change. So they went from singing all these simple, pleasant, rhythm and blues-based pop songs that your auntie and your granny could sing along to and that wouldn't offend anyone, into doing all this really weird, tripped-out stuff like I Am the Walrus and Helter Skelter and Revolution Number 9 and all these really strange tracks that came out on the Beatles albums post-1966. And that seems to have been the turning point when all these social changes occurred. So in the UK, you had the Beatles and you had other groups like Pink Floyd were starting to come through, and their music very early on was very psychedelic, See Emily Play and all that stuff. Yeah. And Syd Barrett, the original frontman of Pink Floyd, is a very interesting character to get into, particularly when you consider the military intelligence backgrounds to many of these key artists, because his father was very closely connected with Cambridge University. And Syd Barrett came out of Cambridge. And Cambridge University has been linked to institutions like the Tavistock Institute and the Fabian Society. And it's all about mind control, social engineering. A lot of the programs along those lines got rolled out of Cambridge University. And it would appear that Syd Barrett's father was involved in some kind of research connected to all of that. And then you have a lot of imagery and symbolism which hints at Syd Barrett having been a trauma-based mind control victim himself. There's a very famous album sleeve, which I've shown in some of my public talks, where you have Syd Barrett in a mask, in a kind of, Venetian-style mask, in front of a mirror. And scattered all around are teddy bears. And these are all classic signs of the presence of mind control, particularly mirrors and teddy bears, hinting at the innocence of childhood that gets corrupted when these victims are traumatized from a very early age. So that's very interesting in itself. So you had all these groups coming out of the UK. Even Status Quo, when they first started out, were on that psychedelic tip before they got into their rock and roll stuff, And then over in the US, all kinds of social changes occurring. You had all the Black Panthers and all this social unrest and all these groups kind of demonstrating about various things. You had the Vietnam War, which got started in the mid-60s. Very interesting story concerning Jim Morrison of The Doors. It's a classic story which was related by Dave McGowan, author of the book Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, talking about all the groups that came out of Laurel Canyon in Los Angeles in that latter half of the 1960s, and how when you do the research into the family backgrounds of pretty much all these key players from that hippie counterculture scene, coming out of California, you find connections into military intelligence and the CIA and the FBI and the Pentagon. And the classic one that's always cited is Jim Morrison's dad, Admiral George Stephen Morrison, who just happened to be the naval commander in charge of the fleet of ships involved in the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which catapulted America into the Vietnam War.
This was a false flag operation, wasn't it? Like 9/11. This was like a 9/11.
And it's been admitted, that the American military have all but come out and said, yes, it was a false flag. And yet this was the event that was used to justify America going into that ground war in Southeast Asia, in which millions of people will have died. So it's absolutely insane. You've got this iconic rock god figure in the form of Jim Morrison, who was seen to be all about anti-war and rebellion and, speaking out against the establishment, and his dad basically started the Vietnam War.
That's so ironic, isn't it? I mean, it's very ironic. But it's questions that people should be asking themselves about controlled opposition here, because of course, my parents remember, this was before my time, but my parents had told me about the the awful of the turmoil of that era, that people were thinking the world was going to end. Literally, people think, well, we might get to 1970, but we're never going to hit 1980. We're doomed. Because it was the Cold War as well. There was the nuclear threat and
all sorts of other stuff. Yeah, the nuclear threat, as you say. Then you had all kinds of events going on, again, on both sides of the Atlantic that were kind of traumatizing people. The Manson murders of 1969, that was a very traumatizing thing for the American public. Then you had all this talk of the age of Aquarius, this new astrological age, which was supposed to be ushered in towards the end of the 1960s. Then you had the emergence of LSD. So you had all these communities of kids that were getting into all this psychedelic, tripped-out music. And out of nowhere, you had characters like Timothy Leary, who was this self-styled acid guru. And he was supposed to be this groovy kind of Harvard College professor that was all about getting these kids to go on these journeys of self-discovery and explore their consciousness and stuff and take this wonderful drug called LSD and just achieve these altered states. But it emerged later, many years later, that Timothy Leary was actually an asset of the CIA, and he admitted to it.
Yes, he was.
You also had this character, Ken Kesey, who was the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, the original novel. And that story is all about mind control, when you get down to it, a mind control institution. And Ken Kesey himself is said to have been a mind control victim. And he emerged at the same time as Leary, going around in this psychedelic van around Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco, where all the hippies were hanging out and listening to all this music, tripping out. And he was distributing free tabs of acid, just giving out this stuff for free. And then it later emerged that Ken Kesey also had connections into the CIA. So everywhere you look, there are connections back into military intelligence, so-called, and government departments. And none of this stuff seems to have happened by accident or by natural organic growth. Everywhere is the imprint of these murky alphabet agencies, the CIA, the FBI, the DEA, the NSA, all of them. And this happens on both sides of the Atlantic as well.
Oh, that's how it's unbelievable. So this is sinister but interesting stuff, Mark, isn't it?
Well, one of the points that I make in all the public talks that I'm now doing about the book is the fact that when you delve back into the early days of the industry and take it right forward to what's happening now, you get a whole bunch of common elements that just keep cropping up time and time again. One of them is connections into military intelligence. Another one is connections to, unfortunately, paedophilia and child abuse. Then you get trauma-based mind control and satanic ritual abuse going back generations. And people might like to ask themselves what any of this stuff has got to do with entertainment, with the music industry. If the music industry is all about having fun, having a laugh, enjoying yourself, which is what we all perceive it to be, then why should there be all these elements present when you do a bit of digging beneath the surface? They shouldn't be there at all.
Well, of course. I mean, if I was in government, and I wanted to keep control of people, I would just do what the Romans do and give them their bread and circuses and just have some kind of entertainment that will keep them distracted. But I wouldn't need to wouldn't need to put any particular thought into it about these. About the kind of, I wouldn't need to put any symbolism or anything like that into it. Anything would do. But that's not what we see.
Yeah. Another point just to make here is the fact that, as I alluded to earlier, the industry does have its favourites. It has its key players. So it will take the likes of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and David Bowie and Michael Jackson and currently the likes of Miley Cyrus and, Britney Spears, Katy Perry, people like that. And they're the ones through whose work we see all the symbolism coming. Madonna is another one that's been used a lot through the decades. So the agenda is very much played out through these key artists. But the vast majority of acts that you see coming through the industry aren't involved in the agenda to that degree. So somebody asked me the other day about Madness. They said they've loved Madness for years, and they realise there's all this nefarious, malevolent stuff going on in the music industry, and they said, please don't tell me Madness are involved in all this. And I said, I've discovered nothing to suggest that Madness are peddling occult symbology or they're putting mind control stuff into their videos or stage shows or anything like that, because the vast majority of acts that we see are there simply to keep the cogs of the machine turning. You know, these dark occult controllers need there to be a healthy, thriving industry so that they can elevate their chosen few to the very top and use them for their nefarious agendas. But they wouldn't be able to do that if they weren't acts just keeping the industry ticking along week after week, year after year. And so I think the likes of Madness and so many others are simply used to keep the industry moving. And there's nothing particularly sinister about the bulk of these acts.
So they're purely functionary. Those are the functionary acts. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I like Madness as well.
Yeah, it's just a point that I wanted to make.
That's fair enough, yeah, and that's good news actually because I like Madness as well. Which is good. I know.
But just going back to the mind control thing and the connections back into military intelligence. I mean, a couple of other common factors that have cropped up throughout are lots of suicides in inverted commas and lots of overdoses in inverted commas.
Yeah.
And then you can go further, and then you start to discover the works of Aleister Crowley and Satanism and dark occult rituals. As I say, these are all aspects that keep cropping up in the story of the music industry, and you might not reasonably expect them to be there, but they are. And I was listening to a fascinating interview the other day, which was on...
Oh, that's Mark Devlin, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed that. I found him very interesting indeed. We're going to take a little break and go to the toilet, get some tea, get some coffee, get whatever it is you are drinking, and come back. But keep the volume on the radio turned up, because I think we're going to put something on there you might like to hear. We were talking about hip-hop during the course of the interview, and I'm going to play some hip-hop, but as I said to Mark when I was talking to him, hip-hop can be very good and it can be very bad. So I'm not going to play you any of the bad hip-hop, don't worry. I'm going to play you some of the good hip-hop, and here it is.
New age is upon us, and yet the past refuses to rest in its shallow grave. For those who hide behind the false image of the Son of Man shall stand before God, 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 God. It has begun, the beginning of the end. Yeah. Voice of racism, preaching the gospel is devilish. A fake church called the Prophet Muhammad a terrorist. Forgetting God is not religion, but a spiritual bond. And Jesus is the most quoted prophet in the Quran. They bombed innocent people, trying to murder Saddam. When you gave them those chemical weapons to go to war with Iran. This is the information that they hold back from Peter Jennings. Cause Condoleezza Rice is just a new age Sally Hemings. I break it down with critical language and spiritual anguish. The Judas I hang with, the guilt of betraying Christ, who murdered him, stole his religion, and painted him white. Translated in psychologically tainted philosophy, conservative political right-wing ideology, glued together sloppily the blasphemy of a nation. Got my back to the wall cause I'm facing assassination. Guantanamo Bay, federal incarceration. How could this be? The land of the free, home of the brave, indigenous Holocaust, and the home of the slaves. Corporate America, dancing offbeat to the rhythm. You really think this country never sponsored terrorism? Human rights violations, we continue the saga. El Salvador and the Contras in Nicaragua. And on top of that, you still wanna take me to prison just cause I won't trade humanity for patriotism. It's like MK Ultra controlling your brain, suggestive thinking, causing your perspective to change. They wanna rearrange the whole point of view of the ghetto. The fourth branch of the government want us to settle. A bandana full of glittering generality, fighting for freedom and fighting terror. But what's reality? Read about the history of the place that we live in, and stop letting corporate news tell lies to your children. Flow like the blood of Abraham through the Jews and the Arabs, broken apart like a woman's heart, abused in the marriage, the brink of holy war, bottled up like a miscarriage. Embedded correspondents don't tell the source of the tension, and they refuse to even mention European intervention or the massacres in Jenin. The innocent screams, U.S. manufactured missiles and M16s weapon contracts and corrupted American dreams. Media censorship blocking out the video screens. A continent of oil kingdoms bought for a bargain. Democracy is just a word when the people are starving. The average citizen made to be blind to the reason. A desert full of genocide where the bodies are freezing and the world doesn't believe that you're fighting for freedom. Cause you fucked the Middle East and gave birth to a demon. It's open season with the CIA bugging my crib, trapped in the ghetto region like a Palestinian kid, where nobody gives a fuck whether you die or you live. I'm trying to give the truth and I know the price is my life, but when I'm gone they'll sing a song about immortal technique, who beheaded the president and the princes and sheiks. You don't give a fuck about us. I can see through your facade like a fallen angel standing in the presence of God. Bitch nigga scared of the truth when it looks at you hard. It's like MK Ultra controlling your brain. Suggestive thinking causing your perspective to change. They want to rearrange the whole point of view in the ghetto. The fourth branch of the government want us to settle. A bandana full of glittering generality, fighting for freedom and fighting terror. But what's reality? Martial law is coming soon to the hood to kill yo while you hanging your flag out your project window. Yeah. The fourth branch of the government, aka the media, seems to now have a retirement plan for ex-military officials, as if their opinion was at all unbiased. A machine shouldn't speak for men, so shut the fuck up, you mindless drone. And you know it's serious when these same media outfits are spending millions of dollars on a PR campaign to try to convince you they're fair and balanced, when they're some of the most ignorant and racist people giving that type of mentality a safe haven. We act like we share in the spoils of war that they do. We die in wars. We don't get the contracts to make money off them afterwards. We don't get weapons contracts, nigga. We don't get cheap labor for our companies, nigga. We are cheap labor, nigga. Turn off the news and read, nigga. Read.
Now, there was the fourth branch by Immortal Technique, the fourth branch of the government, referring to the United States system. And the media is indeed a fourth branch. It is certainly an auxiliary to the state. So we shall continue now with Mark Devlin as we go deeper and deeper into the music industry, what it means and what it can do.
It's just
as well.
Yeah, it's just a point that I
That's
wanted to
news.
make.
That's fair enough, yeah, and that's good news actually, because I like Madness as well.
Yeah,
which is good. I know.
But just going back to the mind control thing and the connections back into military intelligence. I mean, a couple of other common factors that have cropped up throughout are lots of suicides in inverted commas and lots of overdoses in inverted commas.
Yeah.
And then you can go further, and then you start to discover the works of Aleister Crowley and Satanism and dark occult rituals. As I say, these are all aspects that keep cropping up in the story of the music industry, and you might not reasonably expect them to be there, but they are. And I was listening to a fascinating interview the other day, which was on Gnostic Media with Jan Irvin. You know that guy?
I've heard of him. Yeah. Yes. He did a radio show. A couple of radio shows I've listened to. Yeah.
Yeah. He's had a guy on called Hans Utter, Dr. Hans Utter, and he's done loads of shows with him, just looking into mind control through music and how music is used to create mind states and all the stuff that's happening at a vibratory frequency level and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. But on this particular show, he had a guy called John Adams on as a guest, and they were talking about how this guy, John Adams, had been influenced by the work of Dave McGowan. Just to recap, McGowan looked into the family backgrounds of all these key players, of artists coming out of Laurel Canyon, all the major artists in that hippie counterculture scene at the end of the 60s. And McGowan discovered that time and time again, you find the fathers were connected to the Navy or the Army or the Pentagon or, the CIA. And John Adams decided to look into the world of celebrity chefs. And he discovered some very interesting things. We're talking mainly the American celebrity chefs. There was one called Judith Child, going way back to the 1950s, I think, who I'd not heard of before. But he used her as an example. And she was a stated CIA asset. She made no bones about it. She came out and she actually worked for the OSS, the precursor of the CIA. That's how far we're going back. But he decided it'd be very interesting to look into family backgrounds of some celebrity chefs. So I'm not sure whether this applies to the key players in the UK, the Jamie Olivers and the Gordon Ramsays of this world. It would be very interesting to look into it, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
But this guy has looked into US celebrity chefs, and he took the view that, okay, we know that Hollywood movies are completely controlled, and that world has connections to military intelligence, and it's all about mind control and social engineering. We know that the music industry is the same. We know that the television industry is the same. We know that this feeds into the mainstream news bulletins and, you know, shows and newspapers and radio shows. Why would you expect it to be any different when it comes to the phenomenon of celebrity chefs getting up there on TV, reaching millions of people and affecting their dietary habits, you know, influencing what they eat? Very interesting show. And he was talking about how you get somebody with a lot of charisma that's a very familiar celebrity chef, like Jamie Oliver, for example, and if he's telling you that you should be eating more of this and this stuff's really good for you, a lot of people are going to pay attention to that. So is it worth considering whether the world of celebrity chefs even is controlled in that way?
Well, there's very little that's not controlled in that way, so it wouldn't surprise me.
Exactly. You know, everything else is controlled. Why would they leave that one alone? So it just really reinforces the point that connections back to military intelligence with the CIA and agencies similar to that directing what goes out into popular culture, the examples are everywhere when you really get down to it. That's really,
I'm not thought of that before, the celebrity chefs, but of course, that's interesting. TV, of course, is connected with music because the television is one of the major outlets of music. A few programs, especially programs like Top of the Pops. You mentioned paedophilia. Of course, we got to mention the BBC and its own paedophilia record, especially in the music side of BBC, because we've had several DJs accused of abusing young people, and of course Jimmy Savile, who was the presenter of Top of the Pops for many, many years, and I think he has a career that goes back 45 years in the BBC. It's now been accepted and it's been exposed that he was a serial abuser of young people, and the BBC held their hands up in shock and indignation and said, "We had no idea. What a shock! My goodness, he must have done it under our noses, and we somehow didn't. Somehow, through some extraordinary oversight, we didn't know it was happening." Decade
after decade after decade, Director General after Director General after Director General, and they had no idea it was going on.
Because he was doing this from day one. He started on day one. I mean, virtually in the early days of Top of the Pops.
Strange case of the Queen, you know, that nice lady, that dear old lady that's so good for tourism, and she's only got ceremonial significance. You know, she's got no real powers. Even though she owns a third of the planet, but we won't mention that. We got the dear old Queen just happening to knight all these people that later were exposed as serial paedophiles and child rapists. But of course, she had absolutely no idea. And she must be devastated, so embarrassed at what happened. And of course, we have MI5 and MI6, the security services that are there to vet the backgrounds of people that come into contact with the royals and make sure there's nothing nefarious there. And yet, when it comes to all these paedophiles that have been knighted and become sirs and become OBEs, they just happen to have missed this time and 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 time again. But it's all just a coincidence, nothing to worry about. The Queen didn't know. It's just, one big misunderstanding.
Yeah, because it goes back to exactly what you were saying at the beginning, where up at the highest levels, at the highest echelons of these A-list celebrity life, you mentioned paedophilia, and of course, what Jimmy Savile was doing, I'm sure, is just the gatekeeper of the cesspit, as David Icke.
Well, I just want to read a little excerpt here, Ben, which I've included in the book. It comes from the Coleman Experience blog site, which really makes no bones about stuff that it writes about. It doesn't mince its words. It comes right out and says things that need to be said. Brilliant site. And I included this quote because it really resonates. And the quote is, "If you thought for 1 minute that Britain is really as it appears to be, you're very sadly mistaken. Beneath the pomp and pageantry lies a network of paedophilic depravity so vile and despicable it literally beggars belief. Don't be fooled into thinking Jimmy Savile was an isolated case either. He wasn't."
Yeah.
Absolutely. What they're trying to get people to accept is the fact that Savile was just a bad apple that happened to slip through the net. And we've all learned from it, and we've moved on. And yes, it was terrible, but that was that.
A light story.
Absolutely, it absolutely wasn't the case.
Yeah.
I mean, it's in the public domain. It's been reported in the mainstream media that Jonathan King was a serial molester of young
that came
boys.
out earlier. That came out much earlier. King, I think, came out in the early 2000s, and
that's right.
That should have run some alarm bells because. Of course, accusations have been published. David Icke published accusations against Savile in 1998. They were ignored. No one even tried to sue him. He challenged them to sue him, and no one sued him.
Same with Ted Heath, British Prime Minister.
Exactly. And it's and like you mentioned, these parties. I mean, the thing about Top of the Pops, Jimmy Savile would be the person to recruit if you're trying to put yourself in the heads of these sickos, because that's where all the Top of the Pop studios were always filled with young people bopping along, to the latest tune. And of course, it wasn't a rock concert; it was a studio. It was a controlled environment, made to look like a rock concert. But that's where you could get people. You could get these young girls and say, "Would you like the opportunity to meet your idol?"
Yeah.
And they'll say, "Yeah." And so they take them somewhere, and that's when these sex rituals are carried out on these poor.
Well, Jonathan King preferred young boys, and he used to run this disco called the Walton Hop in Walton-on-Thames, and that was a grooming ground for young boys for these paedophile rings. And Jonathan King was very much a procurer of young boys for all these sicko associates of his. Yeah. And then at the BBC, with Savile, it was mainly young girls, although we hear he liked the odd boy as well.
He did.
And there was this case of the Top of the Pops dancer, which recently made the headlines. This girl called Claire McAlpine, who was 15 years of age. She was a dancer on Top of the Pops. You might ask yourself what a 15-year-old girl is doing as a half-naked dancer on a music show in the first place. But anyway, she committed suicide in 1971, and she left behind a note talking about how she'd been sexually abused at the hands of certain BBC presenters. And Savile's name came up, unsurprisingly. And this story, when it broke a few weeks ago, it seemed to implicate Tony Blackburn, although he wasn't directly named as having been a perpetrator. Tony Blackburn was pretty much thrown to the dogs by the BBC in what seems to be an exercise in damage limitation. It seems they were panicking, and the heat was getting turned up, and they thought, my God, what can we do? Let's throw Tony Blackburn to the public and make out that he was somehow involved, and that will make the public think that something's being done, and maybe they'll forget about it, and this story will go away again. So Blackburn appears to have been a victim. I can't say whether he was directly involved in that or not, but as far as I'm aware, there's been no proof that he was. But there have been other BBC radio DJs that have been implicated. There have been...
Dave Lee Travis.
Yeah, Dave Lee Travis was slightly different, because Dave Lee Travis was done for basically fondling the tits of a grown adult.
At least they're grown up.
Yeah, well, at least he waited till she was over 18. Yeah. So, yes, you could argue that fondling somebody's tits when they don't want it is a wrong thing to do.
Yes.
But in my book, it's not in the same league as sexually abusing children.
No, it's less. It's worse. It's much worse if it's children. Yeah. I mean, it's a bad thing. So, sexual harassment's bad.
Alan Fluff Freeman is another name that's come up, and there have been young people, or they were young at the time, that have accused Alan Fluff Freeman of being an associate of Jimmy Savile's, and they've said that they were taken to kinky sex parties at Alan Fluff Freeman's flat in London, at which Savile and many other celebrities of the time were present, and much sexual molestation of minors was going on there. And then, of course, we have the Elm Guest House in Barnes and all the sordid revelations that surround that, and all the names that have been implicated in that.
Yeah. And this is government figures as well as media figures. It's people in politics as well as the media.
Absolutely, yeah. It's senior politicians that, seem to have been rubbing shoulders with the likes of Savile and all these DJs and all these television presenters. They all seem to have been attending the same parties, which suggests that all these different scenes ultimately feed into the same sick nature of the establishment that we've got in Britain.
Yeah.
And of course there are connections into the royals as well, which so many people don't want to acknowledge, but the connections are there.
Yeah.
Jimmy Savile was very closely associated with the British royal family. That's on the public record as well. He was a close personal friend of Prince Charles. He was brought in as an advisor when Charles and Diana's marriage started to falter, and David Icke has asked the question, why would this be? What the hell would an aging, bloody, sleazy DJ be doing brought into these inner circles? Why should there be any connection there at all? Well, everything is ultimately connected. It's all the establishment, and all these sick, depraved activities, as that Coleman Experience article pointed out, are endemic within it.
Yeah, and we can't ask Diana because she had that convenient car crash and
just have to.
Yeah, and a lot of them do. I mean, people must understand. I think a lot of people do understand, based on perhaps the endemic level of TV license evasion now, which has caused the system to break down, basically. But surely people must understand that these crimes could not be committed without a massive network of institutional collaboration. Absolutely not. I mean, from the Director General to the Studio T-Boy. Everyone, if this was any other institution, the police would be in there right now questioning. They'd shut it down, suspend the broadcast license and everything else. But they're not. They never have done. Which is, the BBC have handled this as an internal inquiry, which is a joke.
Yeah.
And
the opportunity is right there for everyone to know what's going on, because there's a phrase that I use often in the book, which is hidden in plain sight. And it's a favourite tactic of the control system. They literally give you, quite blatant sometimes, it's often cryptic and encoded, but other times it's quite blatant, examples and indications of their true nature and what's going on. There's a statue outside of Broadcasting House, the iconic BBC building in London, called Ariel and Prospero. And it's a sort of naked adult male with a naked male child,
some Shakespeare,
writhing against his crotch.
I've seen it. In fact, I did a little video about this. This is actually supposedly from Shakespeare, but these statues were carved by a man called somebody Gill, I believe, when Broadcasting House first opened.
Was it Eric Gill?
Eric Gill, who was he was a paedophile. He was actually in psychiatric care because of various sexual perversions he was carrying out on his own children in some cases. If you go around into the courtyard and look up where the cafe is, the famous BBC cafe where the public and the celebrities can mingle, apparently, there's a statue which is from Midsummer Night's Dream, where you see these people dancing like they do in the play. But the girls are lifting up their skirts. It's so obvious.
And people often try and justify this sort of thing by saying just that. You mentioned, it's from Shakespeare. And so people will say, oh, it's from Shakespeare. That makes it okay because it's art. As long as you put an art tag on it, suddenly it's supposed to be okay. But I don't see that. What I see is a depiction of paedophilia. Yeah. It doesn't matter which way you cut it. It doesn't matter whether it was Shakespeare or, whichever artist it came out of. It's the same thing. So you have Elton John, for instance, is said to have a massive collection of art of this nature. So it's paintings of young naked male boys cavorting with naked male adults and that sort of thing. And because it's got that art tag on it, he's able to get away with it, and he's not investigated or doesn't find himself in trouble with the law because of it. Are you familiar with Chris Spivey, the British writer? Yeah. I mean, Chris Spivey made a great point a couple of years ago when he was doing an article on Elton John and his partner David Furnish, who I hear has cheated on him, apparently. Recently. David Furnish has been putting it around, according to the gossip mags. So, poor old Elton. But anyway, Spivey made the point that these two have adopted two baby boys, quite famously, a few years ago. And Elton John has made no bones about the fact that he's very much into the dark occult, witchcraft, Satanism, and the works of Aleister Crowley. He's one of so many artists that have been obsessed with the works of Aleister Crowley.
That's interesting.
He's also made no bones about it in interviews that he's done shitloads of drugs over the years. And I think there was one interview where he said he was surprised he was still alive with the amount of mind-altering substances and alcohol abuse that he's done throughout his years. And yet, this particular couple were able to adopt 2 baby boys without any kind of objection from social services, despite the fact that they've got all this background to their life story. And
That's
Spidey made
unbelievable.
the point. Well, Spidey made the point. Can you imagine any other couple that weren't a part of the establishment and where one of them wasn't a sir being allowed to adopt 2 babies and bring them into a home that is full of paedophilic art and where, you know, there's a background in witchcraft and Satanism and alcohol and drug abuse? Wouldn't happen.
I know. I mean, I know a bloke.
It seems if you have friends in high places, it can happen for you.
Yeah, I mean, I know a bloke. There are a couple who've actually just adopted a young girl, a little 3-year-old girl, and what they had to go through. They just, like I said, they're not sirs, they're ordinary people. What they had to go through that adoption process was unbelievable. It took almost from they've just adopted her. She's age 3. This began soon after her birth, and they've only just now been allowed to. She's only just been now made. They've got rights of warding and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, it's absolutely incredible. And what's I think is very sad, and I don't like to pass judgment on people, because I know how the psychological warfare aspect of these organisations can induce groupthink and black, white, and all these other Orwellian concepts of turning the other cheek, denial, whatever you call it. But there were people at the BBC who may not have been directly involved with this cesspit, but knew it was there, and they've dropped people like Johnny Rotten, who's of course well known in the music industry, the Sex Pistols. I mean, there's a famous outtake from the Old Grey Whistle test in 1978, where he's saying, he's saying that what Jimmy Savile is what he is, and he knows, and he's saying it.
Clearly.
And this was shown to him.
Did you see the sketch with Frank Skinner as well? Are you familiar with that one?
No.
I think it was Skinner and Baddiel, actually. You can get this on YouTube. Some years ago, they were doing this comedy show, and the subject of necrophilia came up, you know, like it does. And Skinner spontaneously just made a noise like that yodeling sound that Jimmy Savile used to make. He went, you know, at the mention of necrophilia. And that's all that was said. But that, to me, implies some kind of inside knowledge on the part of Skinner and Baddiel as to what Savile was up to. Does it not?
It certainly does. And I mean, I know that Jimmy Savile, I mean, it fills me with shame to say this, but Jimmy Savile worked as a hospital porter. He was a volunteer as a porter at the Leeds General, and several hospitals, in fact. And rumour has it he used to borrow the key to the mortuary on night shifts.
Indeed. And
he was allowed in there, which of course would not normally be done. I mean, normally no porter on the regular staff would be allowed to do that. So yeah, I mean,
special privileges.
Yeah, and what really upset me the most was Esther Ranson. This was the woman who founded Childline, and who said, well, we all knew about it. It was an open. She said things. It's an open secret.
Open secret. Yeah.
But we couldn't really do anything. And I'm looking at this woman, seeing somebody who is in a state of cognitive dissonance. She's part of an organisation, and she has tacitly collaborated, maybe subconsciously collaborated, with the most horrific evil agenda within this organisation, and it seems to have just gone over her head. And
well, it's disgusting. It's just disgusting.
Yeah.
And you've got to look at all these BBC celebrities and television celebrities generally that have had really long careers, decade after decade. And it's the same thing as in the music business. You know, you look at guys like Paul McCartney. /Fall.
Oh, Fall, yes.
We won't go there. We'll call him Sir Paul McCartney.
All right, for convenience.
And then we have Sir Mick Jagger, Sir Elton John. I don't think Rod Stewart is a Sir, is he? Or is he an OBE?
Not as far as I know, no. Not as far as I know.
And Tom Jones, you know, these guys have been around for like 50 years. And they wouldn't have been around for 50 years if they weren't playing the industry game in some way. Yeah. And if they weren't doing what they were told, and if they weren't, you know, adhering to the agenda. So it's the same thing in the BBC. So Esther Ranson's been around for bloody 40 years or whatever it is. And she would not have survived that long if she wasn't somebody that could be relied on to keep her mouth shut and play the game. And Terry Wogan would have been another one. You know?
Yeah. Wonder what secrets he took to his grave.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And we should
read his memoirs.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, do you think that there's these revelations have any connection with there's been a massive rush of celebrity deaths over the last couple of months?
Yeah.
I mean, I've done tributes, actually. I did a tribute to Prince last week, or at the time of recording on the show. The week before that, I did one to Victoria Wood, the comedian who died.
Yep.
We had Ronnie Corbett as well, another great comedian. He died. All these people work for the BBC. Both Victoria Wood
Paul Daniels
died, yeah. All these